In October 2003, the FBI received a distress call from northern Minnesota that would become one of the most classified incidents in Bureau history. 3 families camping in the Superior National Forest vanished without trace, their RVs torn apart as if by something impossibly strong. When our field team arrived to investigate what local authorities dismissed as a bear attack, we discovered evidence of something far worse. The tracks we found were humanoid but wrong. The claw marks went through steel, and the scattered remains suggested a predator that hunted with terrible intelligence. What we encountered over the next 72 hours defied every natural law I had been trained to believe in. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I had been with the Bureau for 11 years when the call came through to our Minneapolis field office on a Tuesday morning. My partner and I specialized in cases involving remote wilderness areas, missing persons in national forests, and situations where local law enforcement needed federal backup. The assignment seemed routine at first. 3 families, 9 people total, had failed to check in from a camping trip in the Superior National Forest near the Canadian border. They were overdue by 36 hours. The local sheriff had found their campsite abandoned with signs of violence. He had contacted the FBI immediately, bypassing state authorities, which itself was unusual. Standard protocol was to treat it as a potential kidnapping or assault until proven otherwise. We drove north through steady rain, the highway cutting through endless pine forests that grew denser and darker as we approached the border region. The drive took 4 hours, and with each passing mile, the forest seemed to press closer to the road. My partner reviewed the preliminary report during the drive. 3 families who had known each other for years, all experienced campers, well equipped. They had reserved a primitive campsite in a remote section of the forest accessible only by logging roads. The area was known for its isolation, which was exactly why they had chosen it. They wanted true wilderness experience away from developed campgrounds and other visitors. The families had checked in at the ranger station 3 days prior, filed their itinerary, and were expected to return the previous morning. When they did not arrive and did not respond to radio calls, the ranger had driven out to check on them. What he found had prompted an immediate call to the county sheriff. The sheriff had secured the scene and called us within 2 hours of his arrival. The sheriff met us at the ranger station just after dawn. He was a man in his 60s with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. Deep lines around his eyes and a permanent squint from decades of bright snow and summer sun. He looked exhausted and deeply unsettled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his hands trembled slightly when he reached out to shake ours. He told us he had been sheriff for 30 years and had never seen anything like what we were about to witness. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a tension that went beyond normal stress. He had dealt with deaths before, accidents and violence both, but something about the situation had shaken him fundamentally. His hands shook slightly as he poured coffee into styrofoam cups, and he kept glancing out the window toward the forest as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. The ranger station felt warm and safe, but his nervous energy made it clear that safety was temporary and conditional. He briefed us while we drank the coffee. The campsite was untouched when the ranger arrived except for the obvious signs of violence. No fire in the pit, no recent cooking. The vehicles were damaged, but nothing had been stolen. Personal items were scattered everywhere, but valuables remained. Wallets, phones, cameras, all abandoned. This was not a robbery or a kidnapping for ransom. Something else had happened. The sheriff had brought 3 deputies with him on the initial response. They had documented the scene and begun a preliminary search of the immediate area. They found blood trails leading into the forest, but no bodies within 100 yards of the camp. They had marked the blood trails and withdrawn, waiting for our arrival before conducting a deep forest search. He said his men were experienced and professional, but they were also spooked. They had found something at the scene that did not make sense. The campsite was 6 miles down a logging road, accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. We followed the sheriff's truck and our bureau SUV, the road deteriorating into little more than a rutted track through the forest. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting everything in gray light that made the forest look lifeless and cold. When we reached the clearing where the families had camped, my first thought was that a tornado had touched down. 3 recreational vehicles were scattered across the site in various states of destruction. But there had been no storms in the area. The sky had been clear until the previous afternoon. Whatever did this had not been wind. The largest RV, a 30-foot motorhome that probably cost $60,000 new, had been flipped onto its side. The entire vehicle, weighing several tons, had been overturned with enough force to leave a deep impression in the ground where it landed. One wall was torn completely away, the metal peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. The aluminum siding was shredded, rivets popped, the internal frame bent and twisted. I approached and looked inside. Belongings were scattered everywhere. Sleeping bags, clothing, food containers, all thrown about as if the interior had been violently searched. The second RV was upright, but the door had been ripped off its hinges and thrown 20 feet into the forest where it hung suspended in the branches of a pine tree. The door was heavy steel with a commercial-grade lock. Faku, whatever tore it off had applied enough force to snap the mounting bolts and twist the frame. The windows were shattered, glass covering the ground in a glittering carpet that crunched under our boots. I could see into the interior. Seats were slashed open, the table torn from its mounting, cabinets hanging open with their contents spilled. The third RV, a smaller travel trailer that appeared newer and less damaged from a distance, had deep claw marks gouged into its aluminum siding, 4 parallel tracks that ran from roof to ground, each one at least 3 inches deep. The marks were too deep and too wide to have been made by any bear. I had worked cases involving bear attacks on campers. Bears could be destructive, but their claw marks were distinct, usually shallower and grouped differently. These marks showed incredible force and a reach that exceeded any black bear by a significant margin. The spacing between the marks suggested fingers or claws spread wide, at least 10 inches from first to fourth mark. I placed my hand against them for scale, and my fingers did not even come close to matching the span. Whatever made these marks had hands or paws far larger than human and equipped with claws strong enough to penetrate quarter-inch aluminum as if it were paper. The campsite itself looked like a battlefield from some ancient war. Camping chairs were not just knocked over, but crushed flat. The aluminum frames compressed into unrecognizable shapes. A picnic table, one of those heavy wooden models that takes 2 people to move, had been snapped in half lengthwise as if someone had brought an axe down through the center. But there were no axe marks, just a clean break that spoke of incredible force, applied in a single motion. Coolers were torn open, their thick plastic walls cracked and split. The contents were scattered and trampled into the mud. Food packaging, cans of beer, packages of meat, all ground into the earth as if something heavy had walked across them repeatedly. The fire pit was cold, ashes damp from rain but surrounded by drag marks in the mud, long furrows perhaps 3 inches deep where something heavy had been pulled toward the forest edge. The drag marks were consistent in width and depth, suggesting steady, deliberate pulling rather than the chaos of a struggle. We found blood everywhere once we started looking carefully, not the spray pattern of arterial wounds, but pools and smears that indicated multiple bleeding sources. The blood had mixed with rain and mud, creating rust-colored patches across the campsite. My partner used presumptive field tests on several samples. All came back positive for human blood. We marked each location with numbered flags for the forensic team that would arrive later. By the time we finished flagging, there were 37 markers across the site. The largest pool of blood was near the overturned motorhome, a concentration perhaps 3 feet in diameter. The volumes suggested a catastrophic injury, possibly a severed limb, or massive torso trauma. Smears led from this pool toward the forest, wide marks as if something had been dragged while still bleeding. I followed the trail for 20 feet before it disappeared into the undergrowth. The pattern emerging from the scene suggested an attack that had been both violent and methodical. The RVs had not been damaged randomly. The largest vehicle was targeted first, flipped to disable it and expose the occupants. Then the others were breached systematically. The attack had probably taken less than 10 minutes based on the concentration of evidence. 9 people overwhelmed so quickly they had no chance to mount a defense or escape in any organized way. My partner photographed everything while I walked the perimeter with the sheriff. The local deputies had already secured the scene and begun a search grid into the surrounding forest. They had found no bodies, no survivors, and no clear trail to follow. The blood had been sent for analysis. Preliminary results showed it was human, multiple sources, consistent with at least 6 different individuals. What troubled me most from the moment I saw them were the tracks. They started near the largest RV, appearing suddenly as if whatever made them had dropped from above or materialized from nothing. The prints led away from the vehicles into the forest in several directions, suggesting multiple attackers or a single attacker that had moved in complex patterns around the site. The tracks were clear in the soft mud despite the rain. They were humanoid, showing clear heel and toe impressions that indicated bipedal locomotion. But they were wrong in so many fundamental ways that my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The stride length was over 6 feet from print to print, far longer than any human could achieve without running at full speed. But these tracks showed a walking pattern, regular spacing, no scuffing or sliding that would indicate running. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy, at least 300 pounds, possibly more depending on soil conditions. The weight distribution was centered but with unusual forward bias, as if whatever made them leaned forward while walking. Most disturbing were the proportions of the prints themselves. The foot was elongated and narrow, perhaps 14 inches from heel to toe and only 4 inches wide at the widest point. Human feet are not shaped this way. Even accounting for extremely tall individuals, the length-to-width ratio was all wrong. The toe marks ended in what appeared to be claw points, deep puncture holes in the mud that suggested hardened keratin or bone spurs rather than soft tissue. There were 5 distinct toe impressions arranged in a spread pattern, more like a hand than a foot. The spacing between tracks varied wildly in ways that violated normal gait mechanics. Some strides were 6 feet, others were 8 feet, and occasionally there would be a gap of 10 feet or more, as if whatever made them could leap incredible distances without effort. In several locations the tracks changed from bipedal to something that looked like quadrupedal movement, showing both hand and foot impressions in a pattern suggesting something that could switch between walking upright and running on all fours. I had been trained extensively in track identification. The Bureau requires wilderness specialists to complete advanced courses in animal behavior and wildlife forensics. I had worked cases involving bear attacks, mountain lion predation, wolf encounters, feral dog attacks, and even one case of an escaped exotic animal. These prints matched nothing in my experience or training. They matched nothing in any wildlife manual I had ever studied. They were outside the parameters of known North American fauna entirely. I knelt beside the clearest impression and placed my hand next to it for scale. The print dwarfed my hand. My partner joined me and took measurements: length, width, depth, stride pattern. We documented everything. The sheriff stood nearby watching us document the tracks and finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He said the local Ojibwe community had been warning people to stay out of this part of the forest for the past month. Multiple families from the reservation had come to his office with concerns. There had been sightings of something moving through the trees at night, something that walked on 2 legs but was not human. Hunters had found kills that did not match any known predator pattern. Deer stripped completely of flesh but left otherwise intact, arranged in piles. The tribe elders had requested a meeting with him 3 weeks earlier. They had used a specific word for what they believed was in the forest, a word the sheriff had heard before in old stories but never in serious conversation. Wendigo. He said it like he was apologizing for even bringing it up, like he knew how it sounded to federal agents with degrees and training. But his fear was genuine and infectious. The deputies standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, hands resting on their sidearms. I did not dismiss the information outright, but I also did not give it weight in that moment. My training was in evidence and investigation, not folklore or cultural traditions. We needed to find the missing families and identify what had attacked them, Based on physical evidence that could be documented and analyzed, the tracks led into dense forest in multiple directions. We would have to follow them systematically and methodically to have any chance of finding survivors or recovering bodies. We organized a search team with the sheriff's deputies and several experienced trackers from the local search and rescue unit. 8 of us total, armed with rifles and equipped with two-way radios. The FBI protocol for potentially dangerous wilderness investigations is clear and specific. Stay together in visual contact. Maintain communication every 15 minutes. Document everything with photographs and GPS coordinates. Extract immediately if lives are at risk or if the threat level exceeds our capabilities. The main track we chose to follow led northeast, away from any maintained trails or Forest Service roads. The forest in this region was old-growth pine and birch, the canopy thick enough to block most sunlight even at midday. Trees here were 200 years old or more, trunks 4 feet in diameter, branches starting 20 feet up. The undergrowth was relatively sparse due to lack of light, but the ground was uneven, covered in fallen logs, exposed roots, and thick moss that made every step treacherous. We moved in a loose line formation, maintaining visual contact with each other while following the clearest set of tracks. My partner stayed close to me, both of us focused on documentation. Every clear print was photographed with a scale marker. Every change in direction was noted with GPS coordinates. The pattern was consistent for the first quarter mile, suggesting whatever made the tracks was moving with purpose rather than wandering. Within half a mile we found the first body, and the scene stopped all of us cold. A man in his 40s, identified later as one of the fathers from the camping group, partially concealed under a fallen pine tree that had been deliberately placed over him. The tree was not naturally fallen, it had been cut or broken and moved into position across the body. The cause of death was immediately apparent, even without medical examination. His chest had been crushed with enough force to collapse the ribcage entirely, driving the sternum inward and rupturing every organ in the thoracic cavity. Both arms showed defensive wounds, deep lacerations that had cut through muscle to the bone. His hands were shredded, fingers broken, indicating he had tried to fight off whatever attacked him. There were bite marks on the shoulders and neck that made my stomach turn. The marks were massive. Individual tooth punctures spaced 3 inches apart in an arc pattern that suggested a jaw width of over a foot. The depth of the punctures indicated teeth that could penetrate human bone. No known predator in North America has a bite like that. We documented the scene with photographs from multiple angles and marked the location for recovery. The body was cold to the touch, rigor mortis fully established. Time of death was likely 24 to 36 hours earlier, consistent with when the families had last made contact with relatives before entering the deep forest. We covered the remains with a tarp from our packs and continued following the tracks. The main trail continued northeast, with additional sets branching off in other directions. The pattern of the attack began to emerge as we found more evidence scattered through the forest. Personal belongings were strewn along the trail as if dropped during flight. A child's shoe, a torn jacket, a woman's purse with its contents spilled. Broken branches marked paths of desperate escape attempts. Blood trails led in circles and loops as if the victims had tried to flee but were repeatedly cut off and driven back. Whatever hunted them had been methodical and strategic, separating the group and pursuing them individually through the forest with terrible patience. The second body we found was a woman in her 30s, wedged between 2 large boulders in a small ravine, as if she had tried to hide in the narrow space and been dragged out forcefully. Her legs were wounded. Her clothing was shredded. The bite marks on her torso matched those on the first victim. Large, impossibly wide, penetrating deep into tissue. A teenage boy was discovered near a stream, perhaps a mile from the campsite. His body showed signs of being carried a significant distance before being left at the water's edge. There was trauma to the skull. The bone fractured in a starburst pattern that suggested a single massive blow. He had bled out from wounds to the abdomen and chest. The tracks around his body showed the Wendigo had circled him multiple times before moving on, as if considering whether to feed or simply kill. Each victim we found showed the same pattern of massive trauma, crushed bones indicating force far beyond human capability, deep lacerations from claws that could cut through heavy clothing and flesh as if they were paper, bite marks that defied classification. The Wendigo had killed with overwhelming power but also with purpose. It did not waste energy. Each attack was efficient and lethal. By late afternoon we had accounted for 7 of the 9 missing persons. 2 remained unaccounted for, both children under the age of 10. A brother and sister according to the registration information. The search became more desperate with this knowledge. If there was any chance of survivors, it would be these children if they had managed to hide during the initial attack and remained concealed. We expanded the search grid and called in additional resources from the FBI field office. A helicopter with thermal imaging equipment was requested, but would not arrive until the following morning due to weather conditions moving into the area. As darkness approached, the sheriff became increasingly insistent that we return to the vehicles and establish a secure perimeter for the night. He was adamant about not staying in the deep forest after nightfall. His fear was genuine and contagious. It affected the other local responders who kept looking over their shoulders, rifles held ready, moving faster than proper search protocol required. They had grown up in these woods. They knew the forest in ways we did not. Their instincts were screaming that darkness would bring danger. My partner and I exchanged glances. We were federal agents trained in tactical situations and evidence collection. We did not make decisions based on superstition or local folklore. Our protocols emphasized thoroughness and systematic approach over fear-based reactions. But we also recognized when local knowledge might have value that our training didn't cover. These men knew this environment. They knew its rhythms and dangers. Their fear was not irrational panic, but genuine survival instinct. We agreed to return to the campsite and establish a base of operations for the night. We would resume the search at first light with fresh teams and better equipment. The walk back through the darkening forest was tense. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind through the pines created whispers that could have been words. Branches cracked in the distance with sounds too regular to be random. We moved quickly, maintaining tight formation, nobody speaking except to report status over the radios. Back at the campsite, portable lights were set up, creating a pool of harsh white illumination that made the darkness beyond seem even more impenetrable. The crime scene unit that had arrived during our search continued processing evidence under the lights. They photographed everything, collected samples, documented the destruction with methodical efficiency. We would have hundreds of photographs and measurements. We would have blood samples and tissue analysis. We would have everything except an explanation that made sense. I slept poorly that night in a motel 20 miles from the site. The images of what I had seen played through my mind in endless loops. The violence was extreme, but what troubled me more was the intelligence behind it. This was not the random savagery of an animal acting on instinct. The victims had been hunted with strategy. They had been separated and driven. The attack on the RVs showed problem-solving ability and understanding of human behavior. Whatever did this understood that humans sheltered in vehicles. It knew how to breach that shelter. It knew that flipping the motorhome would expose the occupants inside. The next morning brought clear skies and the arrival of additional FBI resources. 2 more field agents, a forensic specialist from the Minneapolis office, and a wildlife expert on loan from the Department of Interior who specialized in large predator attacks. The wildlife expert was a woman in her 50s with decades of experience studying bears, mountain lions, and wolves throughout North America. She examined the photographs of the tracks and the bite marks for over an hour before giving her assessment. She confirmed what I already suspected and dreaded hearing. Nothing in the North American fauna matched these characteristics. The prints were too large for any documented human. The gait mechanics wrong for any known primate. The bite radius exceeded that of any bear by a factor of 2. The force required to inflict the injuries we had documented exceeded the capabilities of any natural predator on this continent. Her voice was careful and professional, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. She suggested we might be dealing with an unknown or undocumented large predator, possibly an individual vagrant animal from Canada that had wandered south, or potentially a hybrid of some kind. perhaps a bear with genetic abnormalities that increased its size beyond normal parameters, or possibly a surviving population of an extinct megafauna species that had avoided detection. Her explanations felt inadequate even as she offered them. She was grasping for rational categories to contain something that did not fit any rational category. We resumed the search with expanded teams and full aerial support. The helicopter with thermal imaging equipment swept the area in a comprehensive grid pattern, covering a 5-mile radius from the campsite. The thermal cameras could detect body heat through the forest canopy. They could identify large animals, living humans, even recently deceased bodies before they cooled completely. The helicopter made multiple passes at different altitudes. They picked up nothing alive in the search area except for our ground teams and normal forest wildlife. Deer, smaller mammals, birds, nothing large, nothing anomalous. The 2 missing children were found late that morning by a search team working the eastern sector. A brother and sister, ages 7 and 9 respectively, huddled together in a small natural cave formed by an overhang of granite rock, partially concealed by fallen branches and dead leaves. They were alive but in severe medical distress. Both children were hypothermic from 2 nights in near-freezing temperatures, wearing only light clothing. They were severely dehydrated, their lips cracked and bleeding. They were in shock, unresponsive to initial contact, staring blankly at the rescuers. The medical evacuation was immediate and by the book. The children were wrapped in thermal blankets, given warm fluids, and carried out on stretchers to the nearest clearing where the helicopter could land. The paramedics worked efficiently. Within 20 minutes of discovery, both children were airborne and heading to the nearest trauma center. My partner and I rode in the helicopter with them, standard procedure for witness protection in potential ongoing threat situations. I managed to speak briefly with the older girl during the flight. The medical staff had stabilized her temperature and started an IV for rehydration. She was conscious but barely responsive. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her breathing shallow and rapid. I identified myself and told her she was safe now. I asked her gently if she could tell me what happened. The interview was technically improper without parental consent or a child advocate present, but the parents were deceased and time was critical for investigative purposes. She struggled to form words at first, her throat too dry, her mind too traumatized to organize thoughts. Then she began speaking in a rush, words tumbling out between gasps for air. She said it came in the night when everyone was sleeping. It was hungry, always hungry, never stopped being hungry. She kept repeating this detail. The hunger was the most important thing to her traumatized mind. The Wendigo was driven by hunger that could not be satisfied. She said it took her parents first because they were the biggest. This detail was chilling in its implication. The creature had selected victims based on size, taking the largest prey first. It had hunting strategy and target prioritization. She described something impossibly tall that moved in ways that hurt her eyes to watch. Its joints bent wrong. It twitched and jerked when it walked, as if its skeleton did not fit its body properly. She said its eyes were yellow and empty, reflecting light like an animal but containing no intelligence or emotion, just hunger and purpose. The most disturbing part of her testimony was her description of sounds. She said the Wendigo made sounds like it was trying to talk, but the words were backwards or broken. It vocalized in patterns that mimicked human speech, but the phonemes were wrong, the cadence inhuman. She said it sounded like someone trying to speak while their mouth was full of ice and their throat was torn. It made her skin hurt to hear it. The sounds felt wrong on some fundamental level that transcended normal fear. I documented her statement word for word, even though I knew it would be classified as trauma response by any review board. Children in extreme stress construct false memories. They perceive events through distorted lenses colored by fear and pain. What she described was not possible. It could not be real according to every framework of biology and physics I had been trained to respect. But her terror was genuine. It was not manufactured or exaggerated. She'd seen something that shattered her understanding of reality. That much was undeniable. By late afternoon, all 9 victims had been accounted for. 7 deceased, 2 survivors, all evidence collected and processed. The official investigation would focus on identifying the predator responsible. Wildlife officials would set traps and monitoring stations. The area would be closed to public access until the threat was neutralized. This was standard procedure for a large predator attack. By late afternoon of the second day, all 9 victims had been fully accounted for. 7 deceased with bodies recovered and being transported to the medical examiner's office. 2 survivors stabilized and being treated at a regional hospital under psychiatric observation as well as physical care. All physical evidence had been collected and documented according to FBI forensic protocols. The campsite had been processed completely. We had hundreds of photographs, dozens of physical samples, measurements, and documentation that filled 3 evidence boxes. The official investigation would now focus on identifying the predator responsible and neutralizing the threat. Wildlife officials were already setting up trap stations and monitoring equipment throughout the affected area. Trail cameras with motion sensors, large cage traps baited with meat, tracking equipment. The Superior National Forest would be closed to public access in this sector until the threat was identified and neutralized. This was standard procedure for large predator attacks that resulted in human fatalities. But as we prepared to leave the site and return to Minneapolis for debriefing and report writing, one of the local deputies approached me. He was young, perhaps 25 years old, fresh-faced and probably less than 2 years out of the police academy. He had been part of the initial search team and had volunteered for additional duty helping secure the site overnight. He spoke quietly, positioning himself so the others would not overhear. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. He said he needed to tell me something that happened the previous night. He had stayed behind at the campsite to guard the crime scene equipment and evidence that had not yet been transported out. Standard security protocol required someone to maintain site integrity overnight. He had volunteered because he was young and wanted to prove himself reliable to the sheriff. He had been alone from 11 p.m. until the next shift arrived at 6 a.m. 7 hours in the dark forest with only the crime scene lights and his flashlight. Around midnight, something had moved through the trees at the forest edge just beyond the reach of the portable lights. He noticed it initially as a disturbance in the darkness, a sense of movement where there should be only stillness. Something tall enough that he could see it above the lower branches even in darkness. It was perhaps 15 feet into the trees, just visible as a darker shadow against the general black of the forest. It did not move quickly or furtively. It simply stood there at the tree line, watching him. He said it watched for several minutes that felt like hours. He could feel its attention on him like a physical weight. The hairs on his neck and arms stood up. His training told him to identify threats and respond appropriately. He aimed his flashlight toward the movement, and for a moment when the beam hit it directly, he saw something that his mind refused to fully process. Something skeletal and stretched wrong. Something covered in what looked like matted hair or dried skin that hung in strips. Something with a head that sat at an odd angle on its shoulders. Something with limbs that were too long and bent at wrong angles. He said when the light hit it, the Wendigo made a sound that he would never forget as long as he lived. A clicking noise mixed with something that might have been laughter, or might have been crying, or might have been neither. The sound had a quality that made his teeth ache and his stomach turn. It was the sound of something trying to mimic human vocalization, but failing because the vocal apparatus was not human. The sound echoed slightly as if coming from multiple directions at once, as if the forest itself was repeating it. Then the Wendigo had stepped back into deeper shadow and vanished. It did not run or crash through the undergrowth. It simply ceased to be visible, melting into darkness as if it had never been there. He kept his light aimed at that spot for the rest of the night. He did not see it again, but he felt it out there, watching, waiting. He did not sleep for a single moment during his entire shift. He said he would resign before he ever came back to this forest. He said some things were not worth any paycheck. He walked away, and I was left standing in the clearing as sunset approached, looking at the dark wall of forest and wondering what was looking back. The official FBI report classified the incident as a fatal predator attack by an unknown large animal, possibly a rogue bear or mountain lion exhibiting abnormal behavior. The case was closed pending identification of the animal responsible. Wildlife officials set multiple trap stations and conducted aerial surveys. Nothing was ever caught or documented. The attacks stopped after that night, but I knew the case was not truly closed. Too many pieces did not fit. The reports kept arriving over the following weeks. Local hunters reported finding kills in the forest, deer carcasses stripped completely of flesh, but otherwise intact, stacked in piles as if arranged deliberately. Hikers reported sounds at night, wailing cries that echoed through the valleys and did not match any known animal. Several people reported seeing something moving through the trees in the early morning hours, something that walked upright but moved with an inhuman gait. 3 months after the initial attack, I received an unexpected call from an anthropologist at the University of Minnesota. Her name was on the faculty directory as specializing in indigenous cultures of the Great Lakes region and ethnographic folklore studies. She had been researching traditional beliefs and oral histories in the northern Minnesota Ojibwe communities for over a decade. She had learned about our case through law enforcement channels, through contacts she maintained with tribal police and local sheriffs who trusted her work and perspective. She wanted to discuss the Wendigo legend with someone who had actually investigated a potential incident, rather than just studying it academically. She emphasized this was off the record, purely informational, not for publication or official channels. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in Minneapolis, neutral territory where we could talk privately. What she told me over the next 2 hours changed my understanding of what we had encountered in that forest. She explained that the Wendigo was not mere folklore or cautionary tale to the Ojibwe and other Algonquian-speaking indigenous groups throughout the northern forests. It represented a real category of belief, a documented spiritual and psychological phenomenon tied to specific behaviors and environmental circumstances. The concept appeared in oral traditions going back centuries before European contact. The word itself in the Ojibwe language meant something approximating evil that devours, or spirit of hunger. According to tradition passed down through generations, a Wendigo was created when a person resorted to cannibalism. This could occur through desperate necessity during famine, when winter supplies failed and starvation drove people to consume the dead. Or it could occur through malice, when someone crossed a moral boundary for power or revenge. The act of consuming human flesh transformed the person into something no longer human, something driven by insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied no matter how much it fed. The transformation was described as both physical and spiritual. The person grew tall, their body stretching as if their bones were pulled apart. Their skin became gray or ash-colored, stretched tight over bones that showed through. They lost all human emotion and intelligence except for hunger. They gained impossible strength and speed. They could move through winter storms without clothing, could track prey across any distance, could tear through barriers that would stop any natural creature. The descriptions she shared from multiple tribal sources were remarkably consistent, despite coming from communities separated by hundreds of miles and several dialect variations. The Wendigo was always described as impossibly tall, between 7 and 15 feet depending on the account, always gaunt to the point of looking skeletal, as if starving despite constant feeding, always covered in matted fur or hair, or sometimes appearing with skin that looked like dried leather. Eyes that were pale yellow or white, empty of human emotion, moving in ways that seemed wrong to human observers, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. Most disturbing to me as an investigator were the consistent reports of vocalization. The Wendigo was said to make sounds that mimicked human speech, but distorted, as if trying to use language but lacking the proper anatomy. Witnesses across multiple generations reported hearing voices that sounded broken, words that were backwards or twisted, cries that mixed human and animal sounds in ways that caused physical discomfort to hear. This matched exactly what the surviving child had told me in the helicopter. The anthropologist showed me historical documentation she had compiled from multiple sources, missionary records from French Jesuits in the 1600s describing native beliefs about transformed individuals who needed to be killed, Hudson Bay Company Trading Post journals from the 1700s and 1800s mentioning incidents where tribal communities had executed members who were declared Wendigo. Northwest Mounted Police reports from the early 1900s documenting legal cases where indigenous people were charged with murder for killing someone they claimed had become Wendigo. One case in particular stood out. In 1907, a Cree man named Jack Fiddler was arrested by Canadian authorities for the murder of his own son-in-law. Fiddler was a respected shaman and leader in his community. He admitted to the killing but maintained it was necessary execution of a Wendigo, not murder. According to his testimony, his son-in-law had survived a hard winter by questionable means and had begun displaying the transformation signs, extreme weight loss, despite eating constantly, personality changes including violent outbursts and loss of empathy, superhuman strength during episodes, eyes that looked different, hollow and predatory. Fiddler said the man had attacked members of his own family and tried to bite them. The community elders had confirmed the diagnosis. Traditional protocols required execution before the transformation completed. Fiddler performed the killing as an act of community protection. He was convicted of manslaughter by Canadian courts who rejected the cultural defense. He died in custody before serving his full sentence, reportedly taking his own life rather than living with the knowledge that he had failed to protect his people from something the white authorities refused to acknowledge. The anthropologist showed me dozens of similar cases spanning 3 centuries, patterns of behavior that modern psychology might classify as various mental illnesses or personality disorders, but which traditional indigenous knowledge categorized as Wendigo transformation, patterns of violence that modern forensics would attribute to human perpetrators with exceptional strength or access to weapons, but which fit exactly the documented Wendigo attack characteristics. I listened to all of this and tried to maintain the professional skepticism I had been trained to employ, but the accounts matched too closely with what I had personally witnessed and documented. The tracks that violated normal anatomy, the violence that exceeded any known predator, the methodical hunting strategy that demonstrated intelligence, the survivor's description of something tall and wrong that made sounds like broken speech, the deputy's sighting of something skeletal at the forest edge. The pieces assembled into a picture I did not want to see, but could no longer deny. I asked the anthropologist what someone in my position should do with this information. What action could federal law enforcement take against something that existed outside our framework of understanding? She considered the question carefully before responding. She said there was nothing effective to do through conventional channels. The Wendigo could not be hunted by normal means. It was not simply an animal that could be trapped or shot. It existed in a space between physical and spiritual, between natural and supernatural. Traditional knowledge had evolved specific protections and responses, but these required cultural context and belief systems that modern authorities did not possess. The only reliable protection was avoidance based on respect for traditional knowledge. Stay out of territories that indigenous communities marked as dangerous, especially deep forest areas far from human habitation. Do not camp alone in isolated areas during late autumn and winter when resources are scarce and the Wendigo is said to be most active. Do not dismiss warnings from people who have lived near these places for generations and whose ancestors developed survival knowledge through hard experience. And perhaps most importantly, do not attempt to track or study the Wendigo out of scientific curiosity or bureaucratic necessity. Some phenomena resist investigation. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I returned to my regular duties in the FBI field office, but the case stayed with me like a weight I could not put down. I found myself following up periodically on reports from the Superior National Forest region through informal channels. I maintained contact with the local sheriff who had initially called us. I checked incident reports from tribal police on the reservations. The pattern continued with grim regularity. Every few years there would be reports of someone going missing in the deep forest, usually during late autumn when the first snows came and the temperatures dropped below freezing at night. The bodies were rarely recovered in these subsequent cases. Search efforts would find abandoned campsites or hunting camps showing signs of violence, blood and torn equipment, and tracks that investigating officers found disturbing but could not classify. When bodies were eventually found, usually in spring after snowmelt, the cause of death was officially listed as exposure or animal attack. But the evidence often showed the same underlying characteristics that I had learned to recognize. Extreme trauma, suggesting attack by something impossibly strong. Evidence of predation by something with bite patterns that did not match known species. Signs of intelligence in the kill pattern and victim selection. 5 years after the RV camp incident, I was assigned to investigate another disappearance in the same general area of the Superior National Forest. An experienced wilderness guide in his 50s, a man who had spent 3 decades leading hunting and fishing expeditions through the northern forests, had vanished while leading a small group of hunters from out of state. The group of 4 men had separated briefly to cover more ground while tracking a deer. When they reunited at the agreed-upon time and location, the guide had disappeared. No response to calls or radio signals. His rifle was found leaning against a tree with his backpack beside it, but no other trace of him could be located. The search went on for a week with no results. I went to the site and walked the area where he was last seen. I found tracks in the soft earth near a creek. The same elongated prints, the same massive stride length, the same claw marks at the toe points. I documented them but did not include them in my official report. What would be the purpose? To confirm the existence of something that could not exist according to every scientific principle I had been trained to respect. I spoke with the hunting party before they left the area. They were shaken but reluctant to talk. Finally, one of them admitted they had heard something the night before the guide disappeared. Something moving through the forest around their camp. Something large that seemed to circle their position for hours. They had kept the fire burning all night and stayed together. In the morning, the guide had decided to scout ahead alone. That was when he vanished. The man said the sounds they heard were not like any animal. There were clicks and scraping noises, and at one point something that sounded almost like words but stretched out and wrong. He said they all felt watched the entire time. He said when they found the guide's rifle, it was covered in scratches as if something had tried to bend the barrel. The metal was actually scored. He said they left immediately after that and would never return to that forest. I closed the case as a probable animal attack with the victim's body unrecovered, presumed deceased. But I knew the truth was more complex and more disturbing. Something lived in those northern forests that did not fit any category we had created for understanding the natural world. Something that had been there long before European contact, that the indigenous people had learned to respect and avoid, and that occasionally reminded modern society that there were still places and things we did not control or comprehend. I retired from the FBI 3 years ago. The RV camp case remains officially closed, but it appears in training materials as an example of extreme predator attacks in wilderness areas. The photographs and evidence are studied, but the actual conclusions are never discussed. I think some people within the Bureau know or suspect what really happened, but institutional momentum prevents acknowledgement. To admit the truth would require admitting that our framework for understanding reality is incomplete. I still think about those families sometimes. They were just ordinary people taking a camping trip, enjoying the natural beauty of the forest. They had no reason to fear anything beyond the normal risks of wilderness recreation. They could not have known they were entering territory claimed by something that should not exist, but does. Something that watches from the shadows. Something that hunts when it chooses. Something that can never be satisfied. The Wendigo is real, not in the sense of being a biological species we can classify and study, but real in the sense that it exists, that it kills, that it leaves evidence of its passage that we scramble to explain away. Real in the sense that indigenous communities have known for centuries and tried to warn us about. Real in the sense that there are places in the deep forest where we are not the apex predator, where our technology and our weapons mean nothing against something that exists outside the natural order. I have never returned to the Superior National Forest. I have no desire to see those dark woods again or to hear the sounds that echo through the valleys at night. I know what is there, and I know there is nothing I can do about it. The best I can offer is this account, this warning to anyone who might listen. Respect the old stories. Heed the warnings of those who have lived near these places for generations. Do not assume you understand the wilderness just because you have maps and equipment. And if you camp in the northern forests in late autumn, if you hear something moving through the trees at night, if you see tracks that seem wrong or find evidence of kills that do not match known predators, leave immediately. Do not investigate. Do not try to rationalize what you see, because the Wendigo is patient and the Wendigo is always hungry. And once it has chosen you as prey, no amount of disbelief will protect you from what comes next. The file remains in the FBI archives, case number redacted, location redacted, evidence sealed under national security protocols that ensure it will never be released to the public. But I have my copies, my photographs, my documentation of what I saw and what I know. And I share this account now because someone needs to acknowledge the truth. The forests hold secrets we have not penetrated, and some of those secrets would be better left undiscovered. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.